program. I'm Kate Pickett-Irving, one of the program administrators for the Enterprise Zone program. And with me is Mandy Archer, the other program administrator, who will be presenting the second half of the presentation. Let's go ahead and jump in. This is some summary data from the last grant year, which was grant year 2024. We had over $13.68 million dispersed in grant funds. That included 36 job creation grants awarded. That was over $1.82 million in job creation grant funds. And those folks who created those new jobs created 2,957 net new jobs. We had 117 real property investment grants awarded with over 11.86 million in grant funds for RPIG. And those zone investors who received the RPIG grant leveraged a private investment amount of over $231.24 million. So along with our grant money, there was a lot of private investment put back into those local economies for the Enterprise Zone grant. This is a look at and review of our annual timeline. And I am going to fix my screen really quick. I have something going on. But you can see here, we are right here in the middle. We just received your annual reports last month. And on October 1st, we'll have those renewal applications due. We had that renewal presentation earlier this week. In October, we take those local annual reports and aggregate that data and information and supply a report to the General Assembly on all of the statewide data. We have that due at the beginning of October, and that is given to the money committees of the General Assembly, the House Appropriations Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee. On November 1st is when amendment applications are due. And then, of course, at the end of the year, that is when we're wrapping things up to move into the time for grant eligibility and looking at all of the grant prep that has to be done. So in order for an amendment to be processed in this calendar year, it must be submitted to us by November 1st. We do accept amendments all throughout the year, but for it to be processed in this calendar year, it must be submitted by November 1st. And if it is processed in this calendar year, once it's approved, that amendment is retroactive to the beginning of the year. So let's dive into some of those amendment requirements. So a locality can amend boundaries or local incentives every 12 months from the date of the last amendment. One question that we get a lot is if you're in a joint zone and the other locality in your joint zone amended, does that count towards your one amendment every 12 months? It does not. This is for each locality. So if there are 3 localities in a joint zone, then all 3 localities can submit an amendment every 12 months. Local annual reports have to be current in order for us to approve for you all to move forward with an amendment application. Once we approve an amendment officially, those modifications to the zone are retroactive back to January 1st of the calendar year in which the amendment was approved. And amendments, like I said, are accepted on a rolling basis, but in order to have them approved by the end of the calendar year, they have to be submitted in CAMS by November 1st. So one important thing is that LZAs must meet with us virtually to receive approval before you start with the process at the local level of the public hearing and the advertisements and all of that. We do that so that we can go over everything and make sure that there will be no issues or concerns on our part so that you don't go through that whole process of putting out the ads, having the public hearing, and then you submit everything to us and we say, oh, well, you know, we're not okay with this part of the amendment, or you need to change something, and then have to do it all over again. So we added this slide this year because we've gotten a lot of questions about what that meeting will be like or what that initial submission for approval looks like. And so really you're not having to submit anything in CAMS for that initial approval to move forward at the local level. You'll have a virtual meeting with either me or Mandy, and It'll include a discussion of any changes that you want to be made. So we will specifically look at, if you're doing a local incentive amendment, we'll look at those local incentives, the changes you want to be made, the exact language you want to be used, any conditions of an amendment that you want, of an incentive that you want to change. And then we'll talk about the reasoning for those changes. Then if it's a boundary amendment, we will look at your GIS mapping with you, look at those boundaries, talk about any additions or deletions and the reasoning for them, talk about how it will affect any of the businesses that are maybe deleted from the zone or any of those that are added to the zone. And we'll go over everything in detail. And then usually after that virtual meeting, Mandy or I will send you an email saying, this is a recap or summary of the meeting. These are our understanding of the things that you want to change in terms of an amendment. Please get back to us and let us know if this is correct or if there's any other changes that need to be made. You'll get back to us and either tell us, yes, that's what our intention is, or no, we actually meant to do X, Y, Z. And then once we're both in agreement of what that looks like for the changes that you want to be made, we'll send you another email so you have it in writing saying you have our permission, approval, clearance to move forward at the local level, meet with your Board of Supervisors, Town Council, talk about the changes, schedule that public hearing, and then keep moving forward with the submission of the amendment. This is a screenshot of what our website looks like. We circled where you can find that amendment manual. This is on that page that's specifically for LZAs. Anyone can get to the page. Mandy, if you'll drop the link to this page in the chat, that would be great. But you can look at the amendment manual from this page, and right now the training is up from last year. We'll have this training up very soon in its place. So here is a reminder of all the requirements for submission. I'm going to briefly list them out for you, but we're going to go over all of these in detail. So you have that initial meeting with either myself or Mandy before the public hearing for us to approve you to move forward at the local level. You're going to have your first advertisement and your second advertisement. You'll have your public hearing. You will have the resolution. All local assurances will be completed, signed, and submitted. If you're in a joint zone, you'll have a joint zone amendment agreement, and then you'll submit any maps if it's a boundary amendment and the incentive chart if it's an incentive amendment. So here are the public hearing requirements. Public hearings are a required component of both incentive and boundary amendments. The local governing body must hold a public hearing on the proposed amendments prior to passing the resolution authorizing submission of the application. The public hearing can be held during the same meeting in which the resolution is adopted, or it can be held as a special meeting separately. A lot of times they'll have the public hearing, at the beginning of a Board of Supervisors meeting, or right before it, and then go into the meeting and directly have the Board of Supervisors vote on the resolution and moving forward with the amendment in that meeting, or you can have it separately as stated. It must not be held more than 6 months prior to the amendment. That's really important to remember. Sometimes, I think in the past we've had a locality have held the public hearing and gone through all of that work, but something happened, and that could happen to anyone, and they didn't have the time or the ability to submit it in CAMS, or they forgot to. Who knows what could happen? But you have to submit it in CAMS to us for approval within 6 months of that public hearing. Advertising must be at least 7 days prior to the hearing date. And there are a couple of other advertising requirements that are very specific that are not on this slide that I will pull up during Mandy's part of the presentation and share with you. The public hearing must be open to the public and allow time for comment from the public. And if you do receive public comments, we ask for a copy of those public comments when you submit the minutes of the meeting. So we have to have an official copy of the public hearing meeting minutes. Another question that we often get is, let's say that you're on a very tight timeline to turn around this public hearing and get us that CAM submission before November 1st. And a lot of times that might mean that your next Board of Supervisors or Town Council meeting or City Council meeting is in November after that November 1st deadline. So you don't have time to get an official copy of those minutes where they've been approved at the following meeting of the governing body. You can submit the draft minutes and then submit all of that in CAMS by November 1st and then get back to us with those official minutes that have been approved at the following meeting. And hopefully that doesn't confuse anyone. I'm happy to answer questions about that when we get to the question period of the presentation. So if you're in a joint zone with other localities, the only locality that's required to have a public hearing is the locality that's amending their portion of the zone. So if you're in the joint zone, but you're not the locality amending, you don't have to go through the public hearing process, but there are other documents that have to be signed, including the joint zone amendment agreement, which we're going to go over. There's a note here in that amendment manual at the very end in the appendices. There's a really great timeline to help you with the process. You can put in the date of your public hearing and kind of walk yourself backwards of when you need to do that first public hearing advertisement, when you need to do the second one, and when you need to submit all of that. You can plug in a date and then work your way backwards to make sure that you have the correct timeline for the entire process. A resolution from the local governing body approving the amendment has to be submitted. For joint zones, again, the only locality required to pass and submit a resolution or have a public hearing is that locality amending their portion of the zone. Those resolutions should indicate that the local governing body is applying for an enterprise zone amendment, authorizes the chief administrator acting as the LZA to submit all information needed to apply for the amendment, and authorizes that chief administrator to meet other administrative and reporting requirements throughout the zone. If in a joint zone, it indicates that each locality must complete the joint zone amendment agreement authorizing the application prior to that submission to us in CAMS. And there is a sample resolution located in the amendment manual. You are welcome to use that and just plug in your information for your locality for that amendment.
All right, thanks, Kate. And so I'm going to continue with some of the other information that is, of course, required in your application. And so I'm going to start with that local assurances document. This is just a document that authorizes and certifies the accuracy of information that you're providing in the application. And it is, in addition, it also states that if at any time the locality is unable or unwilling to fulfill its commitment to provide local enterprise zone incentives, or there's been no state incentives utilized within that 5-year period, the zone shall or could be subject to termination. This document, again, is only completed by the locality that's submitting the application, and it is completed and signed following the resolution and the public hearing. There's a place that on the document that you do need to state the public hearing was held on such and such date, and it is signed by the chief administrator of the locality itself. So that could be city manager, town manager, or of course, county administrator. So a joint zone amendment agreement. This, if you are located within a joint zone and you are submitting an application to amend your part of the zone, each locality in that joint zone is required to submit or sign and submit a joint zone amendment agreement. This is regardless of whether the other zones are submitting for their portion or not. A couple things, and again, just as a reminder, all of these documents are in our amendment manual located on the website, and they all have examples or information that can be utilized to complete these forms, put on your letterhead or however you may want to do that. So this particular form certifies that the other participating jurisdictions are in support of you as the one submitting the application. They support your filing of that request. This document is signed by the chief administrator of that locality. So for instance, here you have a photo example. You've got Prince Edward County, Charlotte County, and Lunenburg County. If Prince Edward County is the one that's submitting an amendment application, then they would need to obtain a joint zone amendment agreement from both Charlotte County and Lunenburg County. Now, DHCD does not require the localities like Lunenburg or Charlotte or your joint localities to have a meeting to approve this document. This can be done administratively with the chief administrator. Sometimes localities may choose to have approval or have that approved by their local governing body. That is up to them. So part of that is making sure that you are communicating with your joint zones ahead of time, that they are, and definitely before your public hearing, so that they're in support of your amendment. In addition to, if they need to put that on their agenda for some reason because they choose to go through the process of having that approved, they have time to do that as well. So just as a reminder on your boundary amendments and your size limits. Size limits for counties, of course, minimum 320 acres, but the maximum is 3,840 acres. And the limits for towns, if you were established pre-2005, individual towns or cities, is the maximum of 640 acres. And there is an exception for towns and for those boundary amendment size limits. If during the designation period, you indicated that you were going to use the 7% of the locality's land area or 7% of the total population size, then that is your zone acreage maximum. If you are unsure what your zone acreage maximum is, please reach out to Kate or myself. We do have that in a master list and we can provide that to you. So again, on boundary amendments, if you're adding zone acreage, just a couple reminders, you cannot add for a single site or a single business firm. You must add at least 10 acres. That's the minimum additional requirement. And if it is a joint zone, the portion of the zone in which each locality must still meet the minimum and maximum size requirements. So each individual zone, even in a joint zone, has their maximum size limits. And so you need to make sure you're meeting those. Of course, if you're deleting zone acreage, please, as a reminder, you do have to notify each property owner and business located within the proposed deletion at least 2 weeks prior to the public hearing. And that notification is sent via a letter in the mail. If for some reason you have property owners that have more than one property that is being deleted, you can include all of those properties on one letter, but you need to make sure you're listing out those properties. And also the local zone administrator must demonstrate that the deletion will not have a negative impact on businesses and properties. So some examples of reasons that people are deleting properties are maybe they're residential, their zoning usage has changed, so maybe they are going to be residential. Maybe a parcel has already used the maximum amount of grant eligibility over a time period within a 5-year time period. There can be lots of reasons. Or another thing as well is public owned property. So if it's a city building, a school, anything of that nature, those of course are not eligible to apply for the enterprise zone grant. So they may be something you want to consider deleting. That does not include, I will just make a note, we have a lot of IDAs own property and they are within enterprise zones, or maybe a town or city does own the property, but it's being held with the intent of development. That is different, where you may want to hold on to it in that particular zone, because if someone else is going to be coming in and doing that development or purchasing the property, you may want to keep it in the enterprise zone for that reason. And adding or removing non-contiguous areas. So again, these are all reminders about the amendment process. Each locality is allowed to have up to 3 non-contiguous areas, and that even includes joint zones. So if you are in a joint zone and there's 2 of you, each of you are allowed up to those 3 non-contiguous areas. But the total acreage of those combined non-contiguous areas cannot be greater than the maximum zone size limit allowed. And also keep in mind that the roadways, of course, if you are connecting certain land parcels, you're helping, especially in some of our rural areas, they are taking from one town to another, and they're staying within those 3 non-contiguous areas, then you would have to utilize the roadway, and that roadway acreage does count in that maximum eligibility amount. Listed within our guidelines or in our manual are the map requirements. We do recommend that whomever it is that's doing your maps for you during this amendment process, that you take this page, you hand it to them, and you ask them to follow these guidelines. And this just helps us in many ways to be able to look at the different maps that you're going to be submitting during that application process. So there are 3 maps that we put on the requirement list. Everyone must submit map 1 and map 2. Map 3 is dependent on whether you have zoning districts or not, or different zoning in your area. So the biggest thing is we want to make sure that when you're showing us the proposed deletions, the proposed additions, and the current zone boundary. And we do have that color coded in asking you so that way we can take a look at it pretty easily. Everything's in unison and we know what you're trying to do as a locality. And then we do ask you to include on that particular map some very specific features such as major roadways, airports, industrial parks, things of that nature. The map 2 is basically map of the modified enterprise zone boundary, and you indicate these existing characteristics, such as the type of land that's privately held or publicly held, and some acreage associated with that. And then, of course, again, map 3 is it's a modified enterprise zone showing the boundaries of the existing zoning districts. That is, of course, if you have zoning. And so we would ask for a key of the different zoning districts shown within that enterprise zone boundary. So moving on, just a little bit information about local incentives, because a lot of people make boundary amendments more often than they make incentive amendments, but we want to just review those incentive amendments process as well. So again, you should, regularly monitor your usage and effectiveness of your local incentives. If you didn't get a chance to review, we did have an incentive training back in July, I think it was, that is on the local zone administrator's website as well. There's a presentation and also just some ideas and also a breakdown of what the most used incentives are. You can amend those incentives for certain, especially if they're not being utilized. So during the initial process of designation, you may have had a certain area that you were, as a locality, that you were targeting. And if that's the case, then those incentives worked for that time. If they're no longer being used or something of that nature, you may want to take a look and say, what are we looking at doing? And that is part of what we went over in the incentive training. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're considering an incentive change at any time. Just as a reminder, DHCD does only approve the deletion of a local incentive if the proposed replacement is equal or superior to the incentive previously offered. So we do have cases where sometimes people are just making some changes, such as the percentage of rebate that someone gets or other aspects, or you might be changing an incentive completely from a tax rebate to a fee waiver. It's not necessarily, we're not saying that it has to be dollar for dollar change. We just want to make sure that there are incentives that are being offered to your locality. And also, just as a reminder, those incentives you should not have to qualify for state incentive guidelines or thresholds to qualify for your local incentives. So just as a reminder of the incentive amendments, I think I already mentioned, making sure that you do not have to qualify for those state incentives to be eligible for your local incentive. The locality can set conditions on their incentives as long as it's appropriate and provided there's no conflict with federal or state law. When it does come to local incentives and the changes you may make, the additions, deletions, anything of that nature, we highly, highly encourage you to consult with the local attorney to make sure that you are meeting any of those state or federal requirements. What are some types of local incentives? Again, these are listed out. Real property tax exemption is typically very high on the list. Fee waivers like building permits, that's very high on the list. Some type of other local tax rebates like meals and use tax, especially if you are targeting restaurants, downtown areas, machinery and tools tax type of rebate. Public improvements like facade grants or something of that nature. And also, we encourage you to think about non-financial incentives. Are there such as fast track permitting? That could be a non-financial incentive, and anything else that may help you as a locality put into place what just some extra opportunities for those located in the enterprise zone. Just as a reminder, all the localities and their local incentives are included in the appendix area of our statewide annual report. So what are examples of conditions or what conditions of incentives? So you could place a period placed on the period the incentive is available. So for example, it can only be available 6 months after opening, or maybe they have to apply or they have to come back to you within 1 year that when the business can qualify. Also, what the eligibility criteria is. If for some reason you do want to do some type of incentive where it is maybe a water and sewer or some type of tax rebate. However, maybe they do need to create 1 or 2 jobs associated with that. Or it could be that the more jobs they create, the higher the rebate is. So making sure that you specify those conditions associated with the incentive is very important. And a few guidelines is, that we provide to you is use incentives to accomplish a plan and consider desired outcomes. So do you have a certain area that you want to target? Do you have certain businesses that you're trying to target, business industries? Consider what the return on investment is. So we do know that sometimes this is, I kind of make it earned income versus unearned income as well. And so you may have what's your return on investment if you were to uh, waive that building permit fee, something of that nature. Building permit fee might be $200, but that investment is, $50,000. So think about what the return on investment is, not just the financial aspect of that your locality may be using for that. Establish performance baselines for qualification if you want to, and just monitor them, make sure they're being used. And that's part of the reason that we include that in the annual report so that we can all be monitoring them and seeing what is being used, what may not be being used. Just as a reminder, I think Kay had this up before, requirements for submission of your amendment application. Again, if you haven't met with us yet and you're looking to do an amendment for this calendar year, please get on our calendars because we want to make sure that you have enough time for your public hearings and other information. All submissions will be done in CAMS. We must upload the application into CAMS for you. Just as a side note, there are 2 different applications for the incentive amendment and the boundary amendment. So if you are completing both at the same time, you will have 2 applications to complete in CAMS. However, the documentation that you're submitting is probably going to be overlapping. You can hold your public hearing at the same time, provided you have stated in that public hearing that you are doing both boundary and incentive amendments, things of that nature. You will include copies of the advertisement, number 1 and number 2. Again, the public hearing, the minutes, and any comments. If someone calls into your office because you allow them to make calls about the comments on the public hearing, you need to make sure to record what those are because we do ask for those specifically. The local assurances document, the resolution document, if applicable, the joint zone amendment agreement, those maps, and the incentive charge. And there are two, if of course that's the amendment that you're going for. The incentive charge, there are two types of charge that will need to be completed. One lists out the incentives that you are offering, in addition to all the conditions associated with it. The other one also lists out any incentive, all your incentives, and if it's being changed, deleted, or replaced. And so make sure that you're completing both of those charts in order to be for submission. And that brings us to the end where we do have time for questions. We want to make sure that we are answering those. And of course, you're always able to contact us afterwards via email, but our contact information is listed there. So if you can send it to ezone@dhcd.virginia.gov and or to both Kate and I, we can review those. So
Thanks,
without
Mandy.
further ado.
I was just going to say that I dropped something in the chat. You can see that there's one other advertising requirement that I didn't mention on the slide. 2 ads must be published with the first notice appearing no more than 28 days before the public hearing, and the second notice must appear no less than 7 days before the public hearing. That's in our amendment manual. It's also, I'm going to add that to that slide in the presentation. And it's also a part of that timeline in the amendment manual that you can use to figure out, the process and the timeline that you need to use for your specific date and situation. So with all of that information in mind, what questions do you have at this time? I see Charles. Go ahead, Charles. Hi.
Hi. So I wanted to talk about that if we replace a local incentive, it has to be kind of the same value, impact, whatever. And then so we have a local incentive that expires midnight of this year. It's a machine and tools tax rebate. So midnight December 31st. So if I don't do anything, if city council doesn't take any action, that basically expires. I then have to get that put back in place or something equal to it before November 1st of next year is what I'm hearing. Is that a timeline?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And I know that that language about the equal or lesser value, I think when I was in LZA, it caused me a little bit of anxiety because it's that can be very subjective, what's equal or lesser value. I wanted to add that we've had localities come to us and say, hey, we haven't done an amendment on our incentives in years, maybe even since the beginning of the program. And, uh, our budget is different than it used to be. And so we're not able to provide 100% of this rebate, or we have to give a smaller amount, or we have to do a tiered system instead. And that's something that's okay to change. It's something that as if you can explain to us what's going on, times have changed, the budget has changed. That's something that we can work on you with. And I'll reach out to you after this meeting, Charles, to talk specifically about timing about that situation. But good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
What other questions do you have? I see Chris Bridges typed in the chat. Can we set a time limit on the incentives? For example, permits fee waiver only lasts for the first 5 years of the project. Yes, good question. Yes, you can set time limits on the incentives. You can, at the local level, you can get as specific as you want on the incentives. You can have incentives. We talked about this a lot in our local incentives training last month. You can have incentives for a specific industrial park. You can have incentives for your downtown business district. You can have incentives for specific industries. If you're trying to attract a certain industry to your locality, you might want to have local incentives that are specific to them, that give them a reason to choose your locality. another reason to choose your locality. You'll have a lot of other great reasons for them to choose it. But yes, you can get as specific as you want with those local incentives, and you can set time limits and other conditions that can be a part of the incentive.
And I'll just add that, going back to kind of what Charles was saying, is they said they have one that sounds like it sunsets this year. And so I consider there to be two types of time limits. One is you've got an incentive that is sunsetting because they said, hey, we're going to do this for a certain amount of time. They put it in their budget, and that is, or they put it in their ordinance, however they may have done that. Then it is really allowing them to take a look at that incentive at another time. The other part of that, Chris, too, is that you would definitely want to put, if you're doing like a permit fee waiver, you definitely want to make sure that you're doing, like you said, first 5 years of the project. You wouldn't want a 20-year project to continue on, and they continue to get an incentive that you may have established, like you said, 20 years before. That also can be where a tiered approach is. If you're doing some type of tax rebate waiver, where there is a tiered approach associated with that particular type of incentive itself. And so it's only available for 2-3 years, first year of business. So again, like Kate said, you can get very specific on that. Um, and I think that was all I was saying. Sorry. I felt like I had something else, but that was it right now. I think James has your hand up.
Yeah, I got a question. I know when we were filling out the report that needed to be uploaded in CAMS, we got that in. But as I was looking through, and we're in the process of revamping pretty much everything, but it asked for a resolution that the county had made, and I was unable to actually find the specific document that initiated the entire incentive program. I know we started back in 2006, and I'm sure that there's been some ups and downs within that, and I'm still trying to follow the timeline. But that is an absolute requirement for the enterprise zone, correct? That we have to have some document that we can show that we have actually used it and been doing it. Because what I think we're going to have to end up doing is just revamping our entire enterprise zone handling, because right now it's just been a capacity issue with us in the office. But again, to get that, is it okay if a locality comes back in and passes a updated new resolution to continue from that point moving forward?
That would be okay, but you might not have to do that. You might not have access to some of the older CAMS reports. We'll get into CAMS and look and see if we have some old reports that might have that ordinance, James.
Okay.
And just so you know, this is something that's not just happened to you. It's a common problem. We know that there's a lot of movement in the economic development world in Virginia, and people go from different localities, or move on to different things. And sometimes those things get lost, and that's happened, many times with different localities. So we'll take a look in CAMS, and we'll make a note of that right now and get back to you on that. And hopefully we'll find what you need.
Okay. All right. And I appreciate it. Mandy and all of you all have been doing a great job assisting us. We still working on this thing, but appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And I will just, again, I'll add that if you're doing an amendment, you would have to do a resolution about the amendment, and that would be uploaded to the application. But like Kate said, I just made a note to see if we can find in our documents something that you may be looking for as well. Okay. And I remember what I was going to say earlier was I did just want to remind everyone that we will, again, if you are looking at having your amendment and it be retroactive to January 1st of this year, that's when it's due November 1st of this year. If you are not in a huge hurry, you're trying to take a little bit longer time, they're accepted on a rolling basis. We just have to have set a hard deadline for the current year associated with when, that way we have a time to process them, get them through the correct channels in our agency, and be approved. So again, we'll accept those all year long. You can, start looking at it now if you're like, oh, I may want to do that. However, you would not necessarily have to submit it by November 1st if it is not a, detrimental, if you don't have a company that's trying to locate within a boundary and need to qualify within 2025 or something of that nature, then you could take a look at a later date if you wish.
That's a really good point, Mandy. And just as a reminder for the RPIG, if a business got their final placed in service document in this calendar year, but they're not in the enterprise zone, you would want to make sure to go through that amendment process this year. And the same with the job creation grant. If they wanted to be able to look at jobs created newly this year, then you would want to make sure that you get them in the enterprise zone this year for this calendar year. Are there any other questions? Not seeing any other questions. So you all know that you're welcome to reach out to Mandy or to reach out to me anytime. We're happy to assist. These amendments often need a lot of assistance. It's a lot to think about, and we're happy to help look at GIS maps, to help look at incentives, and to help direct you or assist in any way we can. So thank you so much for your time today, and we will talk to you all soon.